Welcome to the second season of ADAPT, Climate Change and the Built Environment, where we interview professionals across the private and public sectors to discuss adapting the built environment to a changing climate. We believe that ensuring climate adaptation to extreme weather and evolving climate patterns needs us to re-examine what it takes to make our buildings, infrastructure, and communities resilient and adaptable, so that our society can continue to thrive for years and decades to come. And with that, let's get started.
Hi, I'm Jessica Mederson. I'm here as always with Mónika Serrano. Hi, Mónika.
Hi, Jessica.
And today we are talking to Greg Lindsey. We met him last year at the Columbia University Managed Retreat Conference, which is a climate migration conference. And we knew he had to be on our show at some point because of his work with Climate Alpha and the work he does related to climate migration.
That's right. He's also a tech fellow at Cornell Tech's Jacobs Urban Tech Hub, where he leads the Metaverse Metropolis, an initiative, and he's also a senior fellow at MIT's Future Urban Collectives Lab, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Strategy Initiative.
We talked with Greg shortly after Hurricane Helene, which had just been so devastating to so many communities, including Asheville, which of course has been called a climate haven. But the timing was ironic because at the same time we were talking about the devastation and whether there would be any impact on climate migration patterns, there were also articles coming out about all the climate disasters that have pummeled parts of the southern United States and whether that would finally change Americans' interest in moving southward. And in fact, whether they'll start moving up here like I did to Wisconsin. And we'll post a link to some of those articles. But yeah, just because of a quirk of timing, we didn't have those when we were discussing this issue.
We covered a lot in our conversation, but the bottom line is that there's nothing natural about the economic geography of the United States. It was shaped by policy, and we can reshape it by policy again. Let's get to this great conversation with Greg Lindsey.
Hey, Greg, it's great to see you. How are you?
I'm good, Jessica. How are you? How are you, Mónika?
Hello. How was your summer, Greg?
I had a lovely summer. Thank you for asking, because here in Montreal, summers are when all the American urbanists come to town. As soon as school lets out, there is a constant stream, which you can see on Twitter and LinkedIn, of people from Florida and Texas coming here to see our bicycle lanes and our walkable streets and our day after perfect day of no or low humidity and sunshine, which more than offsets the winters. And it's always fun for me because by the time August rolls around, I think I had 4 American urbanist visitors in a week from Dallas, from New Orleans, and so on. That's the point in the season where I'm like, can you please just go now? If you're going to tell me about how terrible my winters are, then why is your home currently unlivable in August? Why do you have 100 days of 100-degree heat in Phoenix? And why are you in my city here? So I always find it funny that that's the time of year where all the Americans just roll into town. And then the rest of the year, I have to hear about how terrible my winters are. Our winters are great.
I have to jump in there because, as I've complained about on this podcast before, I lived in Texas for 16 years and I just hated the heat more every year. But I would say that exact same thing. I would get people up here, and I'm in Wisconsin, people in Minnesota, Wisconsin talk about like cabin fever or winter blues, right? Like that February kind of time frame. But I said I got that every August in Texas because totally locked in the house. It is unbearable to go outside. So I always love it, Greg, when I meet a kindred soul, because I still meet too many people who are like, well, I'd rather be too warm than too hot. And I'm like, really? Have you seen what happens when it gets too warm? But now I digress. I have to say, speaking of Montreal and people going to Montreal or purported climate havens, although again, we're going to have to discuss recent news and that, but let's talk about how we met, because that's already kind of fitting up nicely. We actually met last year at a managed retreat conference at Columbia University. And obviously managed retreat, I think, is even more in the news. This episode isn't going to come out right away, but just for context for our listeners, we are talking as horrific news is still coming out of the Southeast about the aftermath of Hurricane Helene. Obviously, our hearts are going out to everybody who's had to deal with this absolutely tragic situation. But one thing that's going to come out of it, I'm sure, again, is where are people moving? Where should they be moving? All of that. So we're going to talk a lot about that today. Also climate havens, because of course, as all the media reports like to call out now, Asheville, one of the towns that was hard hit, had been identified as a possible climate haven. But let's start first talking about the Managed Retreat Conference. And you were there representing Climate Alpha, right?
Yes, this is all the way back in June 2023. And at the time, I think I just stepped away from actually being the founding chief communications officer, probably my one and only C-suite role in life. Climate Alpha, since renamed AlphaGeo, is a startup founded by my good friend and colleague, Parag Khanna, who's the author of Move and many other books. And the company actually got started from an op-ed that we wrote together in 2013 called Where Will You Live in 2050? We probably could have moved it forward a couple of decades, but that was the kind of op-ed that you write when you're friends and you're sort of spitballing ideas. And the crux of it is that, yeah, in the future, people will choose to move to communities or places with good governance and good climate models. And in fact, Parag also says the company was started when he and his brother had to choose a retirement home for his parents who were looking at Florida, and instead actually settled them inland in California after looking at all these kinds of variables. Yeah, so I was there representing that because to me, being part of what's now AlphaGeo was a position that I always wanted to be in as a journalist. Journalism is great, storytelling is great, but figures of authority are always wary of you. You never get to be in the room for the real conversations. And so by joining, it gave me an opportunity to actually sit in on some of these conversations as we tried to tell this story to both journalists and to those controlling the huge real estate funds that place their money where their bets are in terms of where the future is. It was educational, to say the least. Part of the reason my presentation at Managed Retreat was to really not talk about to the audience, about sing to the choir about what we know to be true. I want to have a meta discussion about how do we talk about it to the money? What is it actually like? What are the arguments that we tried to advance that would resonate with them? And I guess the very short answer is AlphaGeo is still a very small startup that's trying to find product market fit. And these are difficult conversations to have because I will say that I'll pause. I remember being on one call at one point with a brokerage, I won't say who, but they asked us, our clients are interested in knowing when's the last possible moment we can get out of Miami? Like, can you tell us like when that moment is? And I understand that impulse, of course, but the policy side of me is just appalled by this because the last possible moment that private money gets out of Miami is exactly the moment where the public gets left holding the bag.
Greg, tell us a little bit about your background. Are you from Canada and how do you get to where you're at now?
Well, that's a fun story to tell because that picks up where the op-ed left off. I'm American. I'm a journalist by training. So pattern recognition, storytelling are really sort of my core attributes. And I grew up in Illinois, south of Chicago. My family were farmers there. But moving to Montreal was an idea that was incepted by writing this piece with Parag. Interestingly enough, he chose to move to Singapore and became a naturalized citizen there. So he chose maximum governance, but also maximum climate risk. And I moved to Montreal, so I sort of chose maximum climate havenness, at least for North America, and maximum governance dysfunction, you could say here. So we took opposite sides of the bet. We'll see how we end up there. But yeah, when people ask me why I moved to Montreal, I mean, climate's certainly a part of it. I mean, both short term, just in the sense of it's my kind of weather, and longer term as well. But yeah, other layers of governance and culture, and we could talk about these things. But yeah, that's how I ended up here in the land of snow.
Tell us a little bit more about the whole journalism. I mean, I never thought about journalism. Obviously, the storytelling part is a big part of journalism, but like the pattern recognition, I think you said was another part of it. So what is your journalism background and how did that lead to this more climate change space?
Well, I have a lot of interests because that's also journalists are professional dilettantes, a word that I do not find to have much invective behind it personally. But yeah, I mean, the climate discussion got into me, I think probably just through my work on the future of cities. And I got interested in climate migration managed retreat because one thing you do as a journalist, depending on where you are in the sort of flow of publications, is anticipating stories before they're there, like trying to see around corners, which is also why I also get labeled a futurist. That's a futurist is a journalist who doesn't quote anybody. You just put your own hunches forth. But I got into this, yeah. When I was at New Cities, joined a small think tank here in Montreal. It's really got how into this is thinking through these issues and helping leaders of municipalities grapple with the implications of what's about to happen. I also got into this, I should note, I work occasionally with teams of architects as sort of their policy and idea glue guy. And really my baptism into the managed retreat discussion was a 2017 project for the Regional Plan Association, which is the private body of interest in New York that sort of do long-term planning. And in 2017, they were coming out with their once in a generational third regional plan, or fourth maybe. And so I was part of a team of architects, including Susanna Drake, who has done incredible work in climate adaptation, and others. And we were asked to imagine the coasts of New York and New Jersey in 2067, 50 years from then out. So I put my brain to work there as a storyteller, as a futurist. And in our future world, where they had sketched out all these beautiful landscapes, Hurricane Hermine was slammed into Lower Manhattan in 2022 in August. It destroyed Lower Manhattan with Category 5 force. It bankrupted the states of New York and New Jersey. And in an unprecedented deal, the governors Cuomo and John Bon Jovi in this alternate world sold off the Port Authority to help finance it. President Trump died in office in his second term. And in 2024, Mark Zuckerberg was elected president of the United States to advance universal basic income, which derisively became known as Zuckerbucks, and eventually a social housing program called Zucker Huts. And that became the impetus to carry it forward. So that's what I do for fun and for a living. It's there. But these kinds of things gave me the background to start thinking about these issues. And in December 2020, during the pandemic, New Cities, we hosted a conference called Higher Ground, which I still think is the best name for these kinds of discussions. It's such a resonant phrase. And brought together panels of experts, also some of the money people, also the mayor of San Juan, Puerto Rico, and the mayor of Holyoke, Massachusetts, who have been bonded by the fact that massive Puerto Rican diaspora out of Hurricane Maria in 2017 ended up in places like Orlando and in places like Holyoke, not because of geographic location per se, but because of the kin networks and other ways. So a way to wrap up here is I was very interested in how do we help mayors prepare for a climate migrant diaspora that may land on their door hundreds of miles inland, because as we've seen with Hurricane Helene, obviously climate change is not just something that happens to coasts.
Yeah, it absolutely is a threat that affects many. I really appreciated the creativity of that story. Some things to celebrate, some things to be scared about. But anyway, really appreciate it. Can you define for our audience what climate migration and managed retreat are?
Ooh, I would say saying this to an audience like this is tricky. There's no pure thing as climate migration, at least by someone who has agency, right? I think in my studies of this and in talking to people, climate is a factor, one of many factors in how people choose to migrate. And what we're ultimately discussing here, I think, is the salience of climate going forward, and how I think all three of us would argue that we should increase the salience of climate versus other factors. So it's always misleading, again, as a journalist, that when you read stories about climate migrants, they happen to be very wealthy white people who are moving to places like Vermont because they have the agency and the resources to do so. And that's not the policy issue here at play. And then, of course, there's climate refugees, people who might be triggered by a refugee crisis. But in many cases, and I've done work with the New England Complex Systems Institute and others, that, for example, the Syrian civil war was a climate refugee crisis. That drought led to higher food prices, led to unrest, which then led to the refugee crisis into Europe, et cetera. And the geopolitical consequences of that are fascinating. So I think of it in those two things. And so, yeah, it's a question of how the increasing salience of climate in these decisions and in these disasters and carrying it forward. And to your second question, manage retreat should be the question of the policy framework and governance framework in place to argue when risks of a certain location become too high and that must trigger a different outcome for perhaps not relocation, which can be tough, but at least truly minimizing any further development, and then also the redirection of resources to more resilient sites, I'll say inland, but on metaphorical higher ground, if that makes sense. How did I do?
I love that. And I think actually your point about climate migration is like a lot of what Monica and I talk about with climate adaptation too. On the sustainability front, or when it's like you said, climate refugees, like a post-Hurricane Katrina or something, it's really easy to say, okay, yes, A is related to B. But you're right, just like a lot of the issues that come up, right? It's each extreme weather event. We are getting better at being able to say this is caused by climate. For example, in my world, is every construction problem that comes up on a job site, does climate change play a small, big, or no role at all in that problem? I always describe myself as a partial climate migrant. I mean, I left Texas in part because I wanted to be closer to family, but yes, also because I want to leave the heat. And so I always feel like I'm kind of like, well, a cheat when I say I'm a climate migrant. But to your point, you're right. For a lot of climate migrants, that's just one thing they're looking at when they're making the decision. Before we move on, you mentioned the kin network, and I know that was a concept you mentioned to me before that I hadn't heard before. Can you explain what you mean when you talk about like, the kin network and how that relates to climate migration?
Well, I'm not an expert in immigration studies, but my reading of it, almost all, at least certainly international migration, almost all, a little extreme, but much of it, and even domestically as well, flows by word of mouth and flows through kin, through family, and through friends to an extent. And this is why, for example, we're seeing Somali communities in Maine. It's why we see other interesting
And
international,
Minnesota.
and
Sorry, just had to shout
Minnesota.
out the Twin Cities have a big Somali population now, which is cool.
Exactly. So a trigger to that could be some sort of polity impetus, a resettling of refugees, et cetera. But then word of mouth and it becomes kin-based and it starts to flow in from there. And so, for example, I mean, Holyoke, Massachusetts has the highest percentage of Puerto Rican residents of any mainland United States city. So therefore, it was only natural that people leaving Puerto Rico after its grid was so severely damaged in 2017 would end up in Holyoke, Massachusetts. And I remember, yeah, those two mayors at the time were actually meeting each other's constituents. They were like literally linked by this. And so these linkages don't follow the map lines. They follow this. And I always think of the resident image of like slime molds and things, other techniques we can sort of see how organic bonds form. That's where those go. And yeah, to your point there about being a partial climate migrant, I mean, I think it's very telling. Just three examples of what I was talking about is I've had conversations with Skylar Olson, who's the chief economist at Zillow, where she's worked on these metrics. And in fact, I believe it was just announced that Zillow will be incorporating First Street climate data into its listings. So just like Zillow and Redfin normalized walk score and bike score as a way to think about these dimensions of livable places, now they're going to incorporate climate data into this. And so the second part, I think of Daryl Fairweather, who's the chief economist at Redfin. Daryl will be the first person to tell you that she's a climate migrant who moved to Wisconsin. She lives near Lake Geneva, away from Seattle, because in both cases, the wildfire smoke during fire season affects both of those. And so run natural experiments with Redfin data that show if you show people some sort of quantified climate score, people will incorporate that into their decision making and choose another property with lower climate score. So people are to an extent rational if you provide them with this data. So it'll be interesting to see what natural experiments Skylar and Daryl managed to run with this.
Do you know if climate migration data is available? Are all those climate migrants being tracked in some way or another?
Well, see again, who is a climate migrant or how do we understand? And like we don't understand who are climate migrants other than refugees, other than Katrina or now Helene and others, because yeah, it's just a question of talking about it over the fence in your new backyard and talking about it with people you feel safe. It'd be interesting to devise those kinds of surveys to ask people what role climate played in that. And even then, like, how do you normalize that to make sure that people don't want to either hide it from you or try to appease you by telling you the story you want to hear? But yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that we talk about anecdotally, like Jessica just did, or like I would tell you I'm a climate migrant. Exactly. I would identify as such. But yeah, it'll be interesting to sort of pull that out. One note on that, I would say Redfin recently, by recently, maybe in the last year or so, actually has this great graph of all the reasons that people had chosen to move recently. And it's basically a Rorschach blot of America. People chose to move for more space. People chose to move to be closer to family. Some people chose because of remote work. Some people chose because their office called them back. Some people moved because of climate. Other people moved because of their politics, which can include climate. So much noise that separating it out for those purposes, I think will be very, very difficult for us if we were to ask people, are you a climate migrant?
Okay, speaking of data, and I'll have to find it. We'll put the show notes or we'll put the link in the show notes. But I know either the New York Times or the Washington Post this past week, as part of the post-Helene coverage, talked about where people are migrating and how, again, they're still migrating to these areas that face higher risk. So what have you been seeing? We've talked about some people, yes, and I know people are moving to Wisconsin, at least some people, because of climate reasons. But overall, what are you seeing as far as like, are the vast majority of people who are moving, are they moving the right way from a climate change risk perspective or not?
From a climate perspective, Americans have for decades, and are now increasing numbers moving the wrong way. And this gets back to like the salience issue, because yes, from a climate perspective, the exhibited behavior and the aggregate is insane. Of course, when you break it down to individual rational actors, they're moving for reasons that make a lot of sense to them. People, since the pandemic, they wanted space, they want to be outdoors. They chose for governance, in which case you could, in fact, dine outdoors, unmasked, unvaxxed. There was a lot of political sorting that happened because of that, a lot of political polarization and identification of that. So yeah, so people moved. And mostly I think it's because of housing affordability. And that to me as an urbanist is the perverse part, is that, yeah, people move to places like Texas and Florida because they're building homes, and they're building less expensive homes than places like the Northwest, the Northwest to some extent. I was thinking of the Northeast, Massachusetts, Maine, losing population, locked in older populations that don't want to build new housing, or the Great Lakes, which of course they're legacy Rust Belt cities where there's lack of job opportunities. People are moving to housing and jobs. And because of a combination of disinvestment and policy, those are not in the places that are actually better from a climate modeling perspective. So it's that. It's also a cultural thing, as we riffed here at the beginning of this episode. I think it was the economist Edward Glaser who's noted that if you wanted to have one variable to estimate percentage of population growth, I think in the post-war era, it's the median daily temperature in January. Americans like warm weather. And I think for whatever reasons, they choose to optimize for warm weather, even when it becomes perverse, like we see in some of the heat bubbles of the American Southwest and Texas there. Americans don't like winter. And I don't know, we could go on and on about this all day. To me, it's an interesting question of just sort of American culture and the valence of that one, because the most delightful thing for me personally about living in Montreal is like, this is a place where winter is the truest season. And so therefore it's culturally designed around winter. But I think from a question of like steering Americans back from those climate risk areas is going to require policy regimes that basically will allow us to build much cheaper housing in the coastal cities where people would like to live, if possible, where they're migrating from. So they lived there at one point. And also, yeah, perhaps this more cultural reevaluation of this. So I find there's a group chat I'm part of in the Southeast. I won't name any names, but one of them is a well-known contributor in economics, and he refers to big cold. That what we're talking about, the three of us right now, we're all members of Big Cold, spreading this conspiracy to keep Americans colder when, of course, Americans really want warmth. So to which my response is, Big Cold here with us in this room right now? Like, I'm pretty sure America is chosen for big heat.
So I have friends that live in the Nordic countries, in Sweden. My friend is from Venezuela, so we're from the warmth all year round. And he married somebody from Poland, and they live in Stockholm. And they enjoy the winter, and it's really cold there, and the days are short, but they get out and they say there's no bad weather, it's just bad clothing. So they kind of just embrace it. And I understand it's just part of their culture, and they appreciate those summers that are very nice. They never leave Stockholm in July because they say it's absolutely beautiful there. So I think there's definitely a cultural aspect to it.
I
Yeah.
did want to chime in with the same thing. I mean, again, coming from northern Minnesota, there's certainly a fair number of Minnesotans. There's a whole community, speaking of kin networks, of former Minnesotans living down on the border around the McAllen area in Texas on the Mexico border, right? Because yes, they get older, they want the warm weather, plus they get cheap dental care apparently in Mexico. But at the same time, there are a ton of people who live for the winters in Minnesota. That's when you get to go snowmobiling. That's when you get to go dark house and ice house fishing. I like being in Wisconsin because my kids, I put mountain in air quotes, but there's a little mountain half an hour away, so my kids can ski. We don't have to fly to Colorado or Vermont or something to go skiing. I love the line about no bad weather, just bad clothing though, because yes, I always say you can dress for the cold, you can't dress for the heat.
Absolutely. Yes, I love skiing, and I'm terrified of ski slopes just not being as good as they used to be. I live in New Jersey, I ski in Pennsylvania, and the last couple winters have been kind of lame. We go to the ski slopes, and there's locations where you can see branches coming out. That's just not very good ski environment.
On the issue of skiing, the one thing I'll add is that as a would-be futurist, one of the weak signals I keep an eye on is the increasing coding of ski, après ski, and snow as luxury. Because in a world that will suffer from diminishing snowfall, Rockies resorts, etc., like you may have followed, the Winter Olympics is narrowing down its list of sites. There's just not that many locations that could support it. It'll be very interesting to see the 2026 Winter Olympics in Milan, Lake Como, and in the Alps there. I'm very curious to follow this notion of, will we see the rise of snow as luxury, because it will become increasingly inaccessible to people, but we'll see.
We'll have to
Wow.
we'll have to follow that. Greg, at the beginning of the conversation, you mentioned clients that you advise, they're asking you, when should I move away from Florida, for example? So who are you advising on migration and real estate investment? Who are those in the room with the money?
Well, I'll read to you, not to give away any state secrets from AlphaGeo, but a few of the clients that are publicly listed there. So the chairman of AlphaGeo is Chris Marlin, who previously ran international sales for Lennar. So done some work modeling for Lennar, which is their headquarters is in South Florida. But America's one of its largest home builders. I think they traded with DH Horton, back and forth. So thinking about land banking and thinking about that. Oak Tree Capital, Howard Marks, one of America's best investors. They are using AlphaGeo's data and technology to basically run risk modeling. A lot of this is risk modeling. A lot of this is we already bought a lot of expensive real estate. What's going to happen to that value? And so many of the clients that are listed there on the site are already doing that. My favorite of AlphaGeo's clients is actually Atlas Capital, which is co-founded or run in a large capacity by Nouriel Roubini, who is better known as Dr. Doom. He was the economist who predicted the global financial crisis. And Nouriel Roubini does not hold back when he talks about, I think he's referred to them as the idiots who move by the millions to Florida and Texas and the massive stranded assets of coastal American geography. And so he's trying to build, I think, the ultimate disaster-proof portfolio, which is climate resilient real estate, gold, and his own take on crypto. So I don't know good or bad ideas there, but there's someone who's forthright about it. But it is interesting. I was just speaking in New York a few weeks ago to an association known as AFIRE. It is an international real estate investor association. It advertises as having 175 international members with $3 trillion of real estate assets under management. And I know a bunch of them, some very smart folks. Interestingly enough, the real keynote speaker, I was just the help, was Secretary John Kerry, who had a fireside chat to talk about climate, among other things. And it's interesting how it plays out. I think most of the conversations I had at AFIRE, just to give an example, were people nodding. All these firms all have their own chosen climate risk modelers. Listeners may know or may not know that there has been several waves, actually, of startups and other companies creating black box climate modeling models, most of whom in the first wave got acquired by reinsurance companies. So Willis and Aon and all these really big reinsurers to model their own clients and insurance, which of course is a huge piece of this increasing salience as well. And most of them have their own tools and they pick that, but they're also, of course, still prone to human bias and prejudice. But I don't know, I thought it was interesting. Perhaps it's starting to turn. I can tell you, I had one conversation passing with an international investor, I won't say who, but who told me after my talk, pulling out of Florida, we're getting out, we're divesting. So I thought that was interesting, where someone was willing to tell me that, like, we're done with this risk profile. Because the general take is, and this was just the Wall Street Journal just wrote about this, that like, you go where the people are, you go where the rent growth is, you go where the yield is. And this is why investors from around the world are invested in Florida real estate, is because that's where the yield is. It's really frightening to me, the level of risk that runs through the whole global system. My last point on this, and I'll stop, is that, again, one of the things that got me interested in this was in 2016. It was, I believe, Sean Piketty, he was the chief economist at Freddie Mac, the quasi-government housing mortgage agency, who wrote a blog post speculating on what could happen in Florida real estate. Would the risk be priced in orderly, as papers by Jesse Keenan at Tulane and others have written? Or would there be opportunistic selling at the outset, followed by a panicked rush to the exits? And then you get what we saw in the global financial crisis. You get a Minsky moment. Go back to Hyman Minsky, which is that moment where, like, you're like Wile E. Coyote and you look down and you're off the edge of the cliff and you have to rewrite all the risk and everything falls apart. That's what I got to. I should note that when I wrote my scenario with the governors Cuomo and John Bon Jovi, is that it was followed by the crash of 23, where that Minsky moment happened. And I'm still convinced, and Parag's convinced, that Minsky moment is out there if we don't figure out how to diffuse it, where we realize that there is just permanent write-downs in the value of the assets that back a lot of the securities that float around the global financial system.
Speaking again of Florida, and you're talking about clients who want to time the market perfectly, which, quite frankly, if you can't time the stock market perfectly, I don't know how you think you're going to time a real estate market perfectly. But aside from that, what other questions are they asking? And is insurance a big part of this? Are they asking you about, hey, how long can I continue to get insurance for my property in Florida? What are the other things that they're asking you about?
Insurance is mostly an end user perspective. We've been following that. And I know Parag has been like putting out some thought leadership with this as well, and sort of like how AlphaGeo can help the insurers, who are, again, extremely interested in this. I believe, let's see, Ray is one of the customers, one of the clients, and AlphaGeo has been through their own incubator program for building this. So these insurers are trying to build out these capabilities, and the reinsurers as well. But yeah, that seems to be sort of an end user perspective. And we see this, that, yeah, I mean, what's happening in Florida and other places where people cannot afford home insurance. And so what are they choosing to do? Well, they're Americans. So they're just choosing to go without and just see what happens. And I think this is leading to one theoretical and one real scenario right now happening in Florida. The theoretical is that the coasts ultimately become the province of the very wealthy who can simply afford to build without a mortgage, because you can't get a mortgage without the insurance, and to repair any damage from there. So they just simply choose to invest in that. Not ultimately sure what it does to the resale value or the resale market for those properties, but that's one scenario. The second one we've seen play out, and I've seen this in data by John Burns Consulting and others, is that like Florida year over year in 2023-24 has had like a huge upsurge in housing stock availability. And when you drill down into it, you see that a lot of that stock is concentrated in sort of this Tampa-St. Pete area. They got affected by Hurricane Ian in 2022. The years just go by so fast. And in 2022. And so, yeah, so you sort of see the fact that like, yeah, a lot of this housing was damaged by the hurricane. And so therefore it makes you think about like, what shape is it in? What does that do to the values of housing? Like, are we going to fall into this cycle post-Hurricane Helene, where the housing that becomes available in these type markets is the housing that was damaged by natural climate disasters, and so on and so on. And so insurance will play an increasing role in this. And obviously we saw this with Hurricane Helene. I believe only 10% of the affected homes had flood insurance, which is I think most people don't know this, my understanding is a very particular thing. Flood insurance is, most insurance that covers flood in your house is like if a pipe bursts, not as if a climate disaster happens to you. And so, yeah, I don't think in any real world you're going to see people in Appalachia getting flood insurance, even if there is a 1,000-year, a 100-year, a 10-year probability that you can have a hurricane drop that much rain on your door.
When you're having those conversations about climate migration with clients, are there issues or challenges that are not being talked about that may just be secondary effects, right, of climate migration?
Well, I mean, it's certainly the question of like, what is the long-term trajectory of these areas? I mean, I'll say Prague is a great notion of this is that, again, we tend to focus on individuals and not systems, to your point. If you live in a house at the top of the hill that has dug plenty of ditches around it, but your whole town empties out because it sits in a floodplain, what is left for you there? And so I think that secondary thing is this notion of like, well, my property is safe against these risks. Well, the amenities and the social resilience of your community falls apart in the meantime. And that's one of the things I always liked about Prague's approach with AlphaGeo, is that it models both climate risks and social resilience to it as well to create this adjusted model. And I actually think the most difficult part of his model and others that we're trying to build is monitoring in real time the social resilience and social capital left in these communities, like Asheville, to your point. Asheville, a haven, not just for climate migrants, but for people who code as liberals, sort of seen as this sort of blue dot in Western North Carolina that was putting out ad campaigns that had Tyler Belay of Monocle host a weekend there not too long ago. Like, it was really advertising itself as like this sort of bastion in the South for these kinds of people. Well, what happens to that political valence of that community afterwards, about who moves away, who can move away? What happens, of course, to the years of damage and the political feeling there? Like, we don't have really accurate ways of measuring long-term about like what political will locally, state level, and nationally will be to rebuild these places. 2 points on Asheville that stand out is one, of course, listeners may know that like it just happens to be near one of the most critical mines on the planet that mines the superfine quartz that is essential to the global semiconductor industry, which underpins everything. We have yet to see if there'll be supply chain disruptions. And the other things I learned is that even though Helene washed away 2 interstates, which will be rebuilt, operators of rail lines, the private rail lines, have no actual mandate or requirement to do so. So it'd be very interesting to see like what level of freight rail service is permanently written down there and what that does to the economic prospects of those communities as well. So this cycle of mounting infrastructure damage and managed retreat by private interests that choose to abandon these communities, these are hard things to measure, how these feedback loops work. I think there needs to be a lot more actually effort in this and trying to understand how these systems intertwine and how if we can try to model that out. If anybody's listening wants to do a project like that, let me know how I can help. I would love to get involved in terms of doing that sort of systems mapping as we try to figure out that interplay.
I love that systems idea. And we've talked a little bit about that in some of our other episodes about, yes, you can have the most resilient building in the world, but if the roads and the electricity and everything that get to it don't work, it doesn't matter a lot. One thing that I've seen come up, and I don't know if municipalities can afford advice from you guys or not, but is what do you do, right? These municipalities, so many of them rely on their property tax base to fund all their services. So it's hard, obviously, for a mayor to say, sure, I'm going to urge everybody to leave. Or, of course, as people do start to leave, especially if they're people with wealth who can leave, you're then losing the higher property taxes. And so I don't know if you've done any thoughts about what are the options for municipalities, what can they do? I don't know. That just seems like such a hard spot. I don't know if you've
It
thought about
is.
that at all.
Yeah, no, I mean, this goes back to the core cultural question about like who do we abandon? Who retreats? And how do you tell someone, sorry, you have to retreat? I remember this came up, of course, at Columbia in June 23. One of the other presenters was, of course, talking about people in the most vulnerable areas of Louisiana and the bayous. Like that is family and history and legacy that goes back hundreds of years, literally. They're not going to leave. And who am I to tell them to? But at the same time, I think it's madness to reinforce federal highways in the Florida Keys, or like you just simply cannot fortify them enough. So at some point you have to make these decisions. So yeah, I think these are the core issues. And that's one of the things that I think that invisibly shapes the debate in the United States about this is the sense of like places can't pick up and leave. And communities and those networks can't really often be moved. There's a few handful of cases, obviously, during the Obama administration in Louisiana, and I think in Alaska, there were several entire communities that were moved. And I've documented a few other efforts, like airport relocations when airports expand, and they moved entire towns in Kentucky, but that's vanishingly rare. So yeah, so you're not going to hear local real estate interests tell you to move somewhere else because they're incentivized to sell you a home in the area, and you're not going to tell mayors to leave for someone else, really. And so yeah, it becomes a question of like who becomes that entity that chooses to really draw hard lines. And I think that's ultimately why it becomes incumbent to reinvigorate places around the Great Lakes and elsewhere that like to invest in the underinvested communities, because from an equity standpoint, it feels like we can't tell you to leave, but we can at least do our best to reinvigorate those communities that were disinvested. And that there's a lot of discussion around this. The Green New Deal for housing that Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez floated a few years ago, Representative Cori Bush, I think had a lot of provisions about investing, I think, what they called frontline communities that were communities of color that were historically marginalized and disinvested in, and that they should perhaps move to the front of the line for climate resilience funds. And those are the kinds of small p political debates we're going to need to have about like who should get this funding. And that can only be worked out, yeah, in the voting box and our legislative arms of government.
What you were talking about, how moving away from your house, from your community is really hard. And there's psychological challenges there. There's a program in New Jersey called Blue Acres. It has existed for a couple of decades now. There was a fantastic article either in the National Geographic or Scientific American, but we'll make sure we put a link on the notes that goes into the details of the Blue Acres program. And somebody who works for the program elaborates on one of the biggest challenges is to actually convince people to leave their location and actually like get rid of some things that within their home, donate them, like actually leave their stuff. Sometimes we are very attached to things that we own because of emotions, memories associated with them. So there's a lot of challenges associated with migrating, right? For climate reasons or not. But I think it's something that as a society, we're going to have to start just dealing with because it will be necessary in the future. Climate migration aside, I have a question about resilience for you. So there are locations where we may not have to migrate right away. And so we should incorporate resilience, right, to deal with all the effects from climate change. Do you see incentives to encourage incorporating that resilience into the built environment?
Absolutely. I mean, there's too many good programs, I think, to mention here in terms of like figuring out like where we should change building codes, et cetera. I'll just mention my friend Mike Eliasson, who has a book coming out, who's a Seattle-based architect. He has a great slide showing that like basically no home or structure in the United States is built for the climate it was originally designed for, that because of changing climate patterns. And so therefore, there's a massive incentive to basically do a large structural rebuild retrofit of the United States with, passive house and solar panels and triple pane windows. I think all the things you could bring together there. And it would be interesting to see like what an updated version of LEED could look like in terms of creating an incentive race to the top, or what you can do to just basically mandate it. Then there's interesting political questions about how you get various entrenched interest groups that I won't name any names, but have undermined floodplain designations, for example, and others that would try to fight you on this. There's such an interesting struggle. I also think it's interesting what Secretary Buttigieg has done at DOT transportation in the sense of like tying together housing provisions with block grants for infrastructure funding for building roads and things. And it would be interesting to see if you could mandate that if you're going to get funds from DOT, that you need to build climate resilient structures. So I think there's good levers at the federal level to do exactly that. And a couple of years ago, when early in the Biden administration, Kelly Lonnie Main of Buy-in and I wrote an op-ed arguing that when the Biden administration was pushing what would now became the IRA and the CHIPS Act and the others, that you should have geographic provisions. There should be a federal climate score using open source data on this. Get First Street or have a blue ribbon committee decide on the federal climate model and use that to score. This is where we're going to put federal institutions, federal infrastructure, where if you're going to get incentives to build plants for electric vehicles or any other green transition, you're going to have to put it in these various areas. I think that would be fascinating. I'll note one thing is one of AlphaGeo's current initiatives is what we're calling the Industrial Renaissance Tracker. And it's basically trying to predict the stock performance of the mobility and energy and manufacturing companies that are choosing to locate plants in climate resilient areas, typically around the Great Lakes. Basically arguing that the better your site selection, the better your financial performance will be because you will not have disruptions from hurricanes, et cetera, on the regular. So I think that kind of program of my friends in the American South will get angry at me, but they would argue that that's where the supply chains are for vehicle manufacturing. But perhaps those plants should start moving into locations where we once built cars, like Detroit and Ohio and elsewhere, and also combine that climate resilience. So anyway, but yeah, I think there's some interesting federal tools out there that could do this, and then combining it, you're going to have to combine it with local building codes and of course zoning, allowing denser housing to be built. There's a lot of good blocking and tackling there. So yeah, the toolkit is well stocked. It's just a question of how do we use it and how do we take off the bindings that are holding some of it back.
And how do we find the political will, right? I mean, especially when you're talking about allocating federal funds based on this objective data. I mean, the whole point, or at least it used to be the whole point of having your congresspeople and senators was that they were going to bring home federal projects for your district. I used to live in Connecticut when Connecticut and Virginia would fight over who would get the next nuclear subcontract because that was a ton of jobs and a ton of money for the local community. Our federalist experiment, right, is a uniquely challenging in this sort of situation. But again, it's interesting because a lot of times the political money and will often follows the private money and will. So are you seeing more investors interested in investing in let's say the upper Midwest, the Rust Belt?
No, I mean, they're ultimately, that's the thing I learned. And it was Spencer Glendon, who was at Wellington Wealth Management and is now frequently gives talks to corporations and investors and scares the living daylights out of them from all accounts. And he told me early on, when I hosted him, when he joined Higher Ground in December 2020, before I joined Climate Alpha, he warned me that the money is actually boring, that the money does not have agency. The money follows where it perceives people going and that sort of thing, and that it will not dictate and that it will not steer. And that what we think of as patient capital is ultimately not that patient. There's very few sources that are willing to wait for years versus chase shorter term returns. And we're all participants in that system. I mean, as an aside, I also do projects on the future of artificial intelligence and what that should be. And I have very critical thoughts on how that's going. But my entire retirement hinges on NVIDIA right now. So the same thing goes for a lot of this real estate there. And they're going to stay in Florida as long as the yields are there and people keep moving in. Note to that is I've seen deep in their own futurist decks that are all confidential that people have started to ask what happens if that population flow starts going the other way. So they don't think about how can we steer that population flow, but they do think about what if it happens starts going the other way. And then you have the opposite of that question. They don't want to land bank land in the upper Midwest right now. They do want to start land banking it the moment a critical mass of people start moving there. So this is, again, why I'm a big believer in government policy, is that you need that larger government force to shape the rules that will start the process, that will mobilize the private capital. And that's hopefully how America works. And just an example of that, going back to our previous discussion there, the Research Triangle in North Carolina, huge creator of jobs itself and the massive impetus. That is a completely, one could say, artificial creation of President Kennedy's Commerce Secretary, a North Carolina native in the 1960s, who relocated multiple government institutes there to jumpstart that base. There's nothing natural about the economic geography of the United States. It was shaped by policy, and we can reshape it again if we choose.
That was such a good summary. I don't know what to follow it with. That will be the quote that we'll advertise this episode with. So money's not the driver. It sounds like people are the driver. But if those people are not all aware or educated of how drastically our climate is changing, that's a problem.
It is a problem. I mean, it's the problem we all face, right? Like, it's a question of like, this is the frog in boiling water, which of course isn't true. But yeah, it's like, how do you make decisions that anticipate freak outlier events? And I think it's interesting. I do not know what his stance on this is, but like the person to look to is like Nicholas Nassim Taleb of the Black Swan. When Taleb was a financial trader who made an enormous amount of money during the global financial crisis, Taleb's entire modus operandi, which Malcolm Gladwell documented for the New Yorker back in the day, was to basically buy tons of options on disaster. And so every day he lost a little bit of money because things were going great in the early 2000s until things finally blew up. And that's how he profited. He set up a system where he could not blow up himself because he would bet on the blowing up itself. And there's two problems with this for thinking about this in the context of climate. One, of course, is that, yeah, like everyday people, we can't afford to slowly do that. We need to fund our retirements and we want to live in pleasant places. And I don't think people are generally going to choose to live in a place in preparation for the day where they can ride out a climate disaster or they could move to the Arctic and global warming will never touch them. They're just not going to do that. Life has to be lived. We experience it every day. And then the second part, of course, is that even the global financial crisis at least like had a boundary. Governments threw enough trillions of dollars into it that it was recovered. There's no telling if the climate crisis is like this. Again, Spencer Glenda would argue that like the only reason we have a global economy is because of stable climate. That's the reason you can do projections into the future. Without that, you can't project the price of anything effectively. And so your entire models all eventually fall apart and you can't build any new models. So I think of that, like how do you prepare a human mind to like deal with that? And yeah, to your point too, it's tough. People do not want to live, not want to move. 80% of Americans live within 18 miles of their mothers. Like they're not going to leave their moms. I'm one of the 20% who didn't. And I agree, Monica, wholeheartedly with you that the core skill set that we need to develop in the era of the Anthropocene or the Cthulhu scene, if you prefer Donna Haraway, is the ability to move ahead and not look back and keep adapting to whatever environment is in front of you. But like most people don't want to do that. That's why you have solastalgia, the idea of being nostalgic for a climate that's vanished underneath you. People are crippled by that. But yeah, that's the kind of like mental skill set, the personal resilience we need to develop. And not many people want to talk about that. Alex Steffen is big on that and giving classes on this. But yeah, most people are in denial or too afraid or refuse to believe it as a matter of course.
Okay. I find 90% of what you just said, 99% of what you just said, kind of depressing and scary. But I'm also a mom of a teenager and a 20-year-old, and they both say that they want to move south. They do not like the cold, despite me trying to teach them otherwise. But I love that statistic, and I hope that even though they say they're going to move away from me, they won't actually move away from me. So I'm like, I'm enough of a mother that I'm like, even if the world is collapsing around us, at least my kids will be nearby. From a selfish little mom perspective there, I appreciate that. No, I think this is all fascinating and kind of interesting how we already have these themes developing, I feel like, for our different seasons. You're the second person to talk about the benefits of the stable climate. I think one problem, we all know that, oh, yes, at different times, like the dinosaurs, and there were maybe meteors, or it was really hot and muggy at one point, and then there was an ice age. But I don't think we really appreciate, I know I certainly didn't, just how stable our climate has been for the era of the modern human, right? We actually talked to Alice Hill about the entire advancement of the Homo sapien, arguably can be credited to the fact that we've had a stable environment for the last 6,000 to 10,000 years. And now I love you tying in the idea of even having a functioning economy relies on having that stable climate. I just want to emphasize that to our listeners because really until we started this second season, I knew climate change was bad. I knew a warming climate was bad, but I don't think we all realize how good we've had it and how many benefits we have had from having that stable climate. So that's a great point.
Something else sometimes I think about, especially in the summer when I go to farmers markets, is how much trust we put on the climate when it comes to food production. Like, I don't think we think about that when we cook every evening and when we eat. We're really relying on climate that is just not becoming as trustworthy as it used to be before because of what we have done to it.
Our response in the early 21st century is to make sort of mordant jokes about climate. Wow, winter was really warm this year. I mean, it was great, but yeah, I guess something terrible is going to happen, and that terrible thing is going to be agriculture collapse, like that sort of thing. We see this with various commodities, and I thought about about this a lot. That, again, it's the disruption to political systems, and not to get too dark or get too big on this. I alluded to the Syrian civil war earlier, which nearly toppled democratic governments in Europe. Those governments have doubled down on keeping climate migrants from West Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa out of Europe for that exact reason. It's been very well documented by Ian Urbina and many others. And I think about this too in the context of the United States. I mean, there's a great book, I forget the author, called Storming the Wall, which is really about the efforts to boost the security state against climate migration. And the most shocking thing to me of history potentially repeating is that during the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, Colorado set up state checkpoints to keep out Okies there. So we saw it within the United States, individual states setting up checkpoints, denying freedom of movement. And this is happening in Germany right now, where Germany, despite the Schengen zone, has police on its borders to keep out migrants. Like, there's a potentially very scary moment happening here where governance starts to fray, and this integration, which underlies all the supply chains we take for granted, also starts to come apart as well. So it is an interesting time, as the Chinese curse goes, that we live in.
I recently read that Sweden is giving an incentive of $35,000 to migrants to leave Sweden. Isn't that crazy? And as we wind down, I have a question for you, for our listeners who are real estate developers, investors, designers, architects, construction folks, lawyers, and beyond. If you could summarize a piece of advice or action that they can take, what would you tell them?
First I would tell them, if you're not using climate modeling tools like AlphaGeo or any of our competitors, there are many, I mean, definitely incorporate that into it. Think about the role climate plays in both your tail risk of like disaster, but also just in the declining, what it means for the long-term declining value of assets. And then, I guess I would encourage them to think about, like, what are the alternatives? One of the most interesting things that AlphaGeo does, and there's many tools like this, both for climate and also just for real estate stuff. Here in Montreal, there's a fun one called Local Logic, where you can just basically see, like, okay, I have this property, it does well, I like the attributes around it, how would I find more of it? And that's one of my favorite experiments to play, is like, how do I find the places that are like this one? Like, whether that is my coffee shop in my corner with a bike score and a walk score of this, or whether it's a climate location there, and like, how do I identify what those were? I guess I'll end with, for AlphaGeo, we did a whole thing on like which Zoom towns are tomorrow's boom towns, and I think we picked Portland, Oregon as the large city if you had your choice. We looked at some counties outside Nashville and Kentucky. Yeah, basically in Kentucky, just over the border, outside the flood zones, because of course Nashville horribly affected by floods. And so, we were trying to choose these locations that, that were adjacent to booming markets, but maybe offered a measure of safety where people would move. Because we've seen time and again in Florida and elsewhere, for example, that like people will move due to climate, but they don't move very far. They move just far enough, they think, to feel safe again. So are those places truly safe? And if so, is that where we can help them build and put down new roots? So that's what I would encourage you to do, is like up the salience of climate in your investing, and whether that means 10 miles inland from Tampa, or whether that means in undeveloped lands in Oregon or elsewhere. But really rethink about where opportunity lies. I guess the way to sum up is that so much of the discussion in real estate investing is about risk. What is the risk to my assets? Start thinking about the opportunities. Where are the new opportunities?
It's good to end on a positive note. I mean, Mónika and I know that obviously all these topics can be really hard. And so we're always looking for something positive. We also talk about the fact that I think climate change can be so overwhelming that people feel like there's just nothing they can do. So they're just going to basically block it out, which quite frankly is my approach to AI. But I like the idea that, yes, we're not telling people, not everybody is going to be like me and want to move from Texas to Wisconsin. But you can at least look even within your communities. If you're looking for your first house, or if you're looking to move, upsize, downsize, start at least taking these things into consideration. Don't just look at the national floodplains. Look at First Street, like you said. Think about, what the energy options are, the grid. So at least start incorporating those small bits. And quite frankly, we can all demand more from our local, state, and federal governments too, right? Obviously, to your point that people don't always follow the money, the same thing. Politicians follow the people. And so if the people start demanding more from their politicians, the politicians will deliver it. So I appreciate trying to end on a note that's a little bit more helpful. Although I got to tell you, futurists right now, that's got to be a tough occupation. So I don't envy you.
Smiling through the apocalypse, as they say.
Well, thank you for the smile. It was a really enjoyable and educational conversation with you today. So I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us and to share so much of your knowledge with our audience.
Thank you both so much for having me. Despite the content, I had a wonderful time. It was a very pleasurable experience, at least.
I learned a lot. So thank you, Greg, for joining us, and stay in touch.
Thanks for listening to Adapt: Climate Change and the Built Environment. We hope you enjoyed this episode and come back to hear more of our conversations with people leading the way and addressing the issues facing the built environment as our climate changes. Please rate, review, and subscribe, and share our podcast with others who may be interested. And if you have any feedback or suggestions for topics or guests for future seasons, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at adaptthebuiltenvironment@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.